Hi, this is Michael Paul with the New Orleans Scottish Rite College. I want to talk today a little bit about the symbolic lodges of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite and touch a little bit on its history and the organization of them. A number of years ago, I read a quote that I've always liked, and it pertained to Masonry when I joined it in the 1970s. And in trying to find who wrote the quote originally, I've run into a little problem. I've seen several people who the quote's attributed to, so I don't really know who originally said it, but it was, "All Masonry is local." And that has always struck me, as it ideally identified Masonry when I joined. And by that I mean, how I understand that phrase, that quote, is that Masonry, our understanding of the Masonry that we have, particularly in the pre-internet days, was the Masonry that your lodge and the lodges that you visited in your particular area. And that was my understanding of Masonry when I joined it. I knew my lodge, I knew the lodges in my particular area. And my understanding of Masonry was that there was two types of a craft lodge. One was a York Rite, the other was a Scottish Rite Lodge. That's what I knew, that's what I understood for the very early days. And what I didn't know was that this was unique. I thought this was the way Masonry was everywhere. I didn't have the internet to log on and check Masonry here and there in different places. I knew the Masonry that was in my area. In going through the degrees, there was an additional bit of information that I began to learn from this. In a York Rite Lodge, craft lodge, the work was pretty much standard. One lodge to the next, it was the same, and the only time there'd be any difference was if someone made a mistake. The Scottish Rite Lodges, however, around the New Orleans area, there was variance in the ritual. And sometimes it was a little bit, sometimes it was a lot. So that was my understanding. A York Rite Lodge was always the same. Scottish Rite Lodges could be a little bit to a lot different. Now, when I received my third degree, one of the things I was encouraged to do was go visit other lodges. And that's what I did. The first lodges outside of the greater New Orleans area that I visited were still in Louisiana, different places in Louisiana, and they worked the York Rite ritual. I understood this, and I knew that the Scottish Rite Lodges, there was 10 of them in the New Orleans area under the Grand Lodge, and I knew that they were in that area, and I knew that if I got outside of the New Orleans area, I could expect only York Rite Lodges. And their ritual was exactly the same as the York Rite Lodges in New Orleans. Not long after, I had the opportunity to take a vacation to California. And as before, I was told, go visit lodges. Now, my understanding of Masonry outside of Louisiana was very minimal, and I really didn't know what to expect. So as it turned out, I went to the hotel, and I found that down the street from the hotel there was a lodge. So I went and visited and looked outside during the day, and they had a sign up saying that they would have a meeting the very next night. So the next day I got ready and I went down to the lodge, and I enjoyed the meeting. They were not having a degree, they were just regular business. But what I noticed in the opening and closing was different. I thought at first it probably was a York Rite Lodge, but the ritual was not the same as the York Rite that I had experienced. I assumed that it was probably a Scottish Rite Lodge. So after the meeting was over, I went to the worshipful master and talked with him a little bit, congratulated him on a very nice meeting, and I asked him if this was a Scottish Rite Lodge. And he looked at me like he had no idea what I was talking about. And he said, what do you mean Scottish Rite Lodge? And I said, well, is this a Scottish Rite Lodge, one of the Scottish Rite Lodges? He looked confused and he said, oh no, you mean the Scottish Rite, that's down the road, about a mile down this road. You just go down. He said, that's where the Scottish Rite is. And I said, no. What I mean is, does your lodge work in the Scottish Rite craft ritual? I said, and my jurisdiction, we have two types. We have a York Rite Lodge or a Scottish Rite Lodge. He looked completely confused and bewildered. Then a look of horror came over his face. And he said, "Can I see your dues card again?" So I gave it to him, and he ran over and checked in the list of lodges, and he started looking through to see if it was a regular lodge. And he come back, he says, "You're a regular lodge." He says, "Your lodge is listed." He says, "But I have no idea what you're talking about. Scottish Rite Craft Lodge." Well, we talked and I explained a little bit about it, and that's when I learned that outside of Louisiana, not only was it not worked, but it was practically unheard of. It wasn't really until the time of the late 80s and early 90s, with the beginnings of the internet and the various online forums and email lists and such, that more information about Scottish Rite Craft Lodges began seeping out. But regardless of that, there was still, and still is today, a good bit of misinformation about the Scottish Rite craft degrees and pretty much a number of aspects of the entire Scottish Rite. Now, I became aware of one misunderstanding very early on, and actually before I received the degrees from the 4th to the 32nd. I had placed my application for a reunion, and it was either July or August of 1978. I was going to go through the reunion. Earlier that year, it was either late January, early February, but I was going to go to Masonic Week. I had an opportunity to go to Washington, D.C., and I wanted to see what was happening with all the various groups and so forth. While I was there, I had an opportunity to learn of one great misconception. I was talking with different people, and I met one gentleman. He was clearly a very active Mason, had badges all over. And as we talked, he knew that I was relatively young in Masonry. And we got to talking about the Scottish Rite, and I told him that I was joining in that later that summer. He told me that he had been a 33rd degree Mason for some 25 years. And he told me that I would probably find that the 29 degrees of the Scottish Rite were very beautiful and educational, and I should really enjoy them. Now, I've never been the best mathematician, but I didn't understand how someone could receive the 33rd degree in a system that he said only has 29 degrees. I knew something was wrong, so I started questioning and asking a little more, and he told me that, well, actually, he says the 29 degrees are the 29 degrees of the Scottish Rite that are actually worked. He says, we don't work. There's no such thing as craft lodges of the Scottish Rite. And I said, well, yes, they are. And I explained a little bit about the craft lodges in Louisiana. He says, well, I don't believe that they are Scottish Rite Lodges. He says, I've been in 33rd for 25 years. He says, I know the Scottish Rite. There are no such thing as Scottish Rite Craft Lodges. And I asked him, I said, but wait, regardless, 29 degrees plus 3 equals 32. I said, you're a 33rd. And he says, well, the 33rd degree is an honorary degree. It doesn't count in the structure. Well, with all due respect to the good brother who has probably gone to his reward by now, that's incorrect. The 29 degrees are the 29 degrees that are conferred in a valley, a consistory. They confer the 4th degree to 32nd degree. And the misconception that mostly comes about is in which body confers which degrees. Craft degrees of the ancient accepted Scottish Rite are not conferred in a Lodge of Perfection or a consistory or a Supreme Council. Likewise, the 33rd degree is not conferred in a craft lodge, but is conferred in a Supreme Council. These are the bodies that control these various degrees. And just because a craft lodge is not conferred, the degrees of Master Mason, Fellow Craft, and an Apprentice are not conferred in a local valley, does not mean that they don't exist. They do exist. And another of the major misconceptions is that Scottish Rite craft lodges are under the jurisdiction of the Supreme Council. They must be. If they exist, then that's who has to have the jurisdiction. That's not correct. As I mentioned in the previous video, there has been no evidence that either the southern jurisdiction or northern jurisdiction has ever worked in the Scottish Rite craft degrees. They have made provisions for them, they've listed them as saying that this is the slot for our foundational degrees, but because of apparent agreements with the Grand Lodges, the Supreme Councils have refrained from working in these degrees. And the only area where there's a high density, or 10 lodges, of the ancient accepted Scottish Rite are in the jurisdiction of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. But again, these are all lodges with charters from the Grand Lodge. They are not chartered by any means under the southern jurisdiction. Now, what I feel I need to mention once again is that this discussion primarily concerns with the Scottish Rite as worked in the United States, and specifically the southern jurisdiction, northern Masonic jurisdiction. Now, there are bodies outside of the United States which work complete systems of the ancient accepted Scottish Rite. Most of these are bodies who have Scottish Rite Grand Lodges to provide the first 3 degrees, and then the 4th to 33rd degree through a Supreme Council and its subordinate bodies. Now, in the United States, there is a body that works from the Eminent Apprentice degree to 33rd degree in the Scottish Rite. This would be the Supreme Council of Louisiana. And I'm not going to discuss much about this right now. There'll be another video later down where we'll fully explain this and its past associations with the Grand Lodge of Louisiana, but that's for another time. But also discussing the 33rd degree. There has been numerous misunderstandings about this degree as well. And one of the most common misunderstanding is the one I mentioned just a little while ago about the 33rd degree being an honorary degree. Now, this came about because of possible misunderstandings between the dual nature of this degree. In the very early days of the Scottish Rite, when one received the 33rd degree, at the same time he received the office of Sovereign Grand Inspector General. There were 2 different sections of the degree, but they were bound together by one. An honorary Sovereign Grand Inspector General would be one who would be an active member, a Sovereign Grand Inspector General, in one Supreme Council, and for whatever reason may move away and move into the territory of another Supreme Council. Well, sometimes if the Supreme Council felt it wanted to do so, it could make that individual an honorary member of their Supreme Council as a courtesy to him. But he would not have voting rights. In the mid-1850s, Supreme Council Southern Jurisdiction took on a new process. It created 32nd degree Masons into 33rd degree Masons, gave them the 33rd degree, but did not give them the office of Sovereign Grand Inspector General. It made them an honorary Sovereign Grand Inspector General, and that's what we have today as what we call our white caps. This would be someone who did receive the 33rd and final degree of the ancient accepted Scottish Rite, but not the office of Sovereign Grand Inspector General. They are honorary Sovereign Grand Inspector Generals. So the honorary aspect of a white cap is not the degree, but the office of Sovereign Grand Inspector General. Part 2 of this video is going to discuss the 16th District of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana, which is a Scottish Rite district. We're going to take a look at some of the history, organization, and nature of these Scottish Rite Lodges. I appreciate your viewing. Any comments, please leave them in the bottom comment section. We're going to leave a list of recommended reading for further information on this subject, also down in the description section. And I appreciate everything you've done. Thank you for watching.